The layoff hit like a slap with no hand. Not even a phone call, not even a thank you. Just a dry email before 8 in the morning, cutting off my 17-year story with the company right then and there. No explanation, no face-to-face. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. But when I opened the attachment and saw the digital signature, I knew. It wasn't carelessness, it was a decision. And they thought that by getting rid of me quietly, they had won. They just forgot one small detail. I knew exactly what they were hiding. My name is Ethan Holloway. I'm 55 years old. I live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I worked for 17 years as a systems architect at Crest Hill Dynamics, a tech company focused on industrial automation. I wasn't the kind of employee who showed up in internal campaigns or gave speeches at conventions. But everybody knew. If the servers were running and the data was safe, it was because I was behind it. I was never one to stir the pot. I preferred the silence of logic to the noise of egos. But the funny thing is, silence sometimes bothers people who don't know what to do with it. My routine was steady. I'd get there every day around 8:15, park in the same spot by Building B, grab coffee with the security guys and head up to the 8th floor. Nothing out of the ordinary. My job was to keep the digital infrastructure running smoothly. Firewalls, protocols, redundant networks, encrypted documentation. I basically held the keys to the vault. And over time, that turned into an invisible kind of power. A power that, little by little, started making people uncomfortable. The first signs of change came disguised as modernization. A new CFO, an operational restructuring plan, a few flashy external consultants. At first, I thought it was just another phase. Every company goes through cycles, but I started noticing that decisions we used to make together were now being made without me. New contracts, unknown vendors, and a strange rush to overhaul systems that, honestly, had never failed. That's when Damian Krause showed up, the new chief financial officer. Young, ambitious, the kind of guy who talks while looking over your shoulder. By his second week, he was already rewriting processes I had built based on years of hands-on operation. He had the usual speech about efficiency and cost-cutting, but what really worried me was how he avoided talking about security, and more than that, how he completely ignored the alerts I sent. One day, I found an email in my inbox about a credentials change I hadn't requested. It was subtle, just a simple redirect of logs to an alternate server, but it set off a red flag. I checked the IP. The access came from outside the building. And even worse, the request had been approved by someone who didn't even work in IT. That wasn't normal. And it wasn't a mistake. It was coordinated. At the same time, my relationship with Travis, my direct supervisor, started going cold. The guy who used to call me the ship's anchor started leaving me out of important meetings. When I asked about technical decisions, he dodged the questions. And instead of handling things face-to-face, he started sending me everything in writing, like he was building a paper trail. The vibe turned heavy, but I still wasn't ready to believe it was betrayal. In my personal life, things were starting to wobble too. My wife, Lorraine, could tell I was more tense, more withdrawn. It's just work, I'd say. But inside, I could already feel the gears locking up. It wasn't just stress. It was a gut feeling. Like something was being put together behind my back. A trap built with the same tools I had taught everyone there to use. And what hurt the most during that phase wasn't the suspicion. It was the effort I made to keep believing there was still loyalty in that place. That after all those years treating the company like it was my own, someone still saw me as part of the family. Little did I know, behind all the good manners, my layoff was already being written. They were just waiting for the right day to send it. The layoff came with no warning, no meeting, not even a glance. At 7:58 on a Monday morning, as I was still opening my email with cold coffee in hand, I saw the message titled, "Termination of Employment, Immediate Effect." It didn't even start with my name, just a PDF attachment, digitally signed by someone who had never looked me in the eye. Not even Travis had the guts to call me. This wasn't just a layoff. It was a cold-blooded execution, and a silent one. I took a deep breath. Inside, something sank. But on the outside, I just closed my laptop, got up, put on my coat, and walked out of Crest Hill's office without saying a word to anyone. No one knew yet. The news hadn't leaked. And as crazy as it sounds, part of me felt a strange kind of relief. The truth was right in front of me now. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. It was fact. And when it comes to facts, I've always known how to work with those. That very same day, I went to my bank and reviewed all recent transactions in my account. Nothing seemed out of place. Not yet. But something told me that was just the surface. Even though the email didn't say it, I knew that layoff had been ordered. It wasn't about cutting costs. It wasn't restructuring. It was payback. Payback dressed up as an administrative decision, and I needed to figure out who was behind it. I spent the afternoon in silence, didn't say a word to Lorraine. Of course she noticed, but she didn't ask right away. She knows how to read my silences. All I said was, "Today was the first day of a new chapter." She nodded, not knowing what I meant. And there, sitting on the porch, watching the heavy sky, I started mentally retracing every step from the past few months. Because if they had taken me off the board, they must have thought I had no moves left. But that's where most people get it wrong. They think loyalty means passivity. Yes, I've always kept a low profile. I always held my tongue when I believed diplomacy could solve it. But I was never blind, and I never stopped taking notes. And what most people underestimated, my memory, my organization, my read of the room, that was exactly what was now rising up, not just as a shield, but if needed, as a sword. Travis sent me one last message 2 days later, short, by the book. It simply said, "We wish you success in your next chapter." Not a phone call, not a thank you, nothing. The same company I helped shield from countless cyber threats was now treating me as the threat, like I was disposable. And that kind of institutional betrayal hurts more than any insult, because it comes clean, wrapped in formality. From that day forward, I stopped trying to understand why. My focus shifted to something else, how it was done, and more importantly, why now? I started digging through logs, public documents, names that popped up in internal meetings. Not out of anger, but with precision. Like someone silently putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle, knowing that once it's complete, the full picture will speak for itself. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for justice, and justice starts with truth. And the most ironic part is, when someone thinks they've silenced you, that's when you speak even louder. Not with your mouth, with facts. And that night, as I typed out the first notes into an offline notepad, a single phrase popped into my head and kept echoing until I fell asleep. They kicked me out of the room, but forgot I was the one who built the building. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. It was still dark outside, but my mind was already wide awake. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. Something inside me had realigned overnight. I knew that the blow had been planned with time and method. And if I wanted justice, I couldn't respond impulsively. I had to be even more precise than they were. So instead of job hunting, I opened a blank spreadsheet and wrote at the top, "Strategic Reconstruction." I started by listing the names of everyone involved in the decisions over the past 4 months. Not just the obvious ones, Travis, Damien, that ghost-like external consultant, but also the satellites, the ones who knew, the ones who stayed quiet, the ones who carried out orders without question. Then I pulled up the old backup versions of the system configurations. I hadn't broken into anything, hadn't accessed the post-termination system, but everything that was public, legally archived, or available in internal reports. I had it all from before. Between cups of coffee, I began tracing the contract trail, and that's when the pattern became clear. 3 companies with inflated contracts, all loosely connected, and one of them had a partner who shared the same last name as Damien's wife. Coincidence? Maybe. But in IT, we learn that where there's a pattern, there's intent. And this pattern was loud. You'd have to try not to see it. I went to the office of an old trusted colleague, Greg Matheson, a lawyer who specializes in corporate governance. I laid everything out for him calmly. He listened quietly, asked a few blunt questions, and in the end just said, "You're not imagining this. This is solid." That was the first spark of validation I'd felt since the fall, and it was enough to ignite something inside me. It wasn't about getting fired anymore. It was about what they were hiding while they fired me. I went home that night with a different purpose. It wasn't about bruised pride anymore. It was about justice and protecting others who might get caught in the same web of silent corruption. There were people still working there who trusted Travis, trusted Damien, folks who had no idea their decisions were being manipulated, and I wasn't going to let that slide, not this time. I knew that to expose what was going on, I had to be surgical. No empty accusations, no online drama. That would only weaken the power of the facts. So I started building a dossier. Documents, old emails, public contracts, notarized copies, financial records. Every item with a date, source, and context. There would be no room for doubt. If any of them tried to deny it, the system itself would confirm what I was saying. Lorraine watched me in silence. She never asked exactly what I was up to. But every night she'd leave a cup of tea by my desk and say, "If you're going to do this, do it all the way." And that was more than support. That was foundation. Because to move forward with something this big, this risky, this full of heavy memories, you need someone who's willing to hold the silence with you. And she did. On the 8th day, I finalized the main file. I gave it a discreet name, Compliance Notes, Technical Version V1.3. I saved it to 3 flash drives. One for me, one for Greg, and one hidden in an old toolbox my dad used to store tools. I didn't know yet when I would act, but I knew how. And more importantly, I knew that from now on, they weren't in control of the narrative anymore. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was reviewing an internal audit report I had saved months earlier, just in case. Back then, I thought it was just another redundant document. But that day, when I cross-referenced it with the new contracts signed by Cresthill, something clicked. One of the service providers, a company called Silverback Consulting, had changed its legal name exactly 2 weeks before receiving its first payment. And the registered address? The same luxury condo complex in Boulder where Damien's brother lived. My stomach turned. This wasn't just questionable ethics anymore. It was fraud. And carefully planned fraud. I started digging deeper into the other vendors and found an even more troubling pattern. Staggered transfers into shell corporations, all tied to companies with different names, but sharing the same registered agents. In other words, the same group of people creating separate companies, changing the names and rotating the contracts. The kind of setup you only build when you think no one's watching. I decided to pay a visit to a former tax analyst I trusted, who used to work at the company's headquarters. Using a technical excuse, I asked to review some public supplier transaction records. He was skeptical, but didn't say no. 15 minutes later, I had in hand the contracts filed with the Colorado Secretary of State and a few financial reports. And that's when it hit me. 3 of those companies, including Silverback, were officially tied to Derek R. Krause, Damien's brother-in-law. He was listed as the financial manager in 2 of them, and the incorporator of the 3rd, all under different names. Everything legal, everything dirty. It was a hall of mirrors, multiple addresses, different EINs, and a network of unknown partners used to mask the money flow. The engineering was clever, but not flawless, because people who build scams like this don't expect someone on the inside, someone with memory, systemic insight, and technical skill, to connect the dots. And I was connecting them. What once seemed like a poorly explained firing now had names, last names, and registration numbers. That's when the name Jason Feeney resurfaced, the consultant who came and went like a ghost. I found out he wasn't just an external hire. Years ago, he had worked at one of Damien's startups, which collapsed under a federal investigation for accounting irregularities. And now, like a recycled script, he'd reappeared at my old company as the guy in charge of supplier optimization. When I found his signature on one of the funding approval memos, I knew the fraud was bigger than I thought, and I had stumbled right into the heart of it. At that point, I wasn't thinking about revenge. This was bigger than me. It was institutional. A gaping wound covered up with contracts and spreadsheets. And if no one stopped it, the company I helped build would turn into a bottomless pit. I had to act, not for pride, for justice. And justice, in this case, required method. I couldn't come off as a bitter ex-employee. I had to look exactly like what I was, a technical expert presenting solid, documented evidence. I started preparing a separate report, one that any executive could understand. Clear language, simple diagrams, public references, and verifiable sources. I knew exactly who I'd deliver it to. Robert E. Camden, a member of the governance board. A man who had always shown integrity. He was the neutral piece missing from this board. He had direct access to the holding company's compliance committee, without having to go through Travis or Damien. The hardest part was holding back the anxiety. When you uncover this kind of quiet betrayal, the instinct is to shout. But I knew. The one who shouts first loses credibility, so I kept calm. Kept refining the report, double-checking every detail, reviewing every contract, and when I finally looked at the folder with everything complete, evidence, connections, transaction history, I realized they had no idea what was coming, and that gave me peace. On the morning of the quarterly board meeting, I arrived early at the holding company's building, dressed like any ordinary visitor. I carried a black folder, discreetly stamped with the Camden & Associates law firm logo, Greg's office. On the outside, it looked like just another technical report. But inside, there were over 70 documented pages, cross-referenced invoices, public records, hidden organizational charts, and a complete map of the fraudulent operation. What they didn't know was that, on that day, I wasn't the man they fired. I was the invisible detonator. Robert Camden greeted me with a firm handshake and a serious look. We'd known each other for years, but this was the first time we met outside of a formal company event. We sat down in a small, quiet room, and for 40 minutes, I laid out everything point by point, no embellishments. He didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, he simply said, "You did your part with honor. Now it's our turn." In that moment, justice stopped being a hope and started to take shape. Less than 24 hours later, Greg called me with a brief update. They've launched an internal investigation and brought in external auditors. From there, it all snowballed. The contract system was suspended, pending transactions frozen, and on a rainy Tuesday, Damian Krause was temporarily removed by unanimous decision from the ethics committee. Temporarily, but he had no idea what was still coming. Travis tried to fight back, played the outraged act, claimed he didn't know anything, tried to deflect by saying financial decisions weren't his responsibility. But the system told the truth. CC'd emails, signed memos, approval authorizations under his login. None of it was accidental, and when investigators cross-checked digital approvals with network access logs, it was clear, he knew, and he gave the green light. What once was speculation became hard evidence. Jason Feeney, meanwhile, vanished, literally. Disappeared from social media, disconnected his work phone, and, according to flight records, flew from Denver to Cancun 2 days after Damian's suspension. But the FBI got involved due to the amount of money and signs of interstate fraud. In the end, what started as an internal scandal turned into a federal case, and Crest Hill made headlines. The story hit the Denver Business Journal with the headline, "Multinational Executives Investigated for Phantom Contract Scheme." No mention of my name. No Ethan Holloway. But those who knew the story knew who lit the fuse. And that, for me, was enough. Because true justice doesn't need a spotlight. It's proven in the silence of those who once mocked your resolve and now scramble to erase their tracks in a panic. Some former co-workers called me. Others sent short messages. "Now I get why you were so quiet," one of them said. And the most surprising thing? Even though I no longer worked there, my name began to circulate with a quiet respect, as someone not just known for competence, but for courage. The courage to act without hate, without ego, without spectacle. Just facts. And that night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. Not because of what happened to them, but because of what I refused to become. I could have exposed everything online. I could have acted out in bitterness. But I chose the longer road, the harder one, and also the most dignified. Because in the end, the greatest revenge is not becoming like them. It took weeks for the internal investigations to turn into formal proceedings. And when the dust finally started to settle, the names were already set. Damien was indicted for corporate fraud and tax evasion, facing possible federal charges. Travis, on the other hand, took a plea deal and lost his position quietly, but for good. And Jason? He was found by Interpol in Belize, detained and extradited. Crest Hill would pay a heavy price for its negligence, but it would survive, because now, at least, the bleeding had been exposed. I received a formal offer from the board to return as Chief Information Security Officer, with full autonomy to overhaul the contract system, audit vendors, and build my own team. A position of absolute trust. But I turned it down. The decision had been made long before the offer ever came. I didn't want to return to a place where trust only showed up after the damage was already done. I had nothing left to prove. Not to them, not to myself. Some tried to reconnect. Travis sent a long message, saying he'd been under pressure, caught between a rock and a hard place. He asked for understanding. I replied with just 2 words. I understand. Nothing more. Damien, on the other hand, called me directly. A missed call I never returned. And when I found Lorraine in the living room, the phone still buzzing in my hand, I simply said, "That was the last sound this story needed to make." She smiled, and we moved on. Meanwhile, an investment firm, one that had followed the case from a distance, reached out to me. They wanted help reviewing the digital security protocols of other companies in their portfolio. They offered a high-level consulting contract with geographic freedom and full technical autonomy. I accepted, because sometimes the door that shuts is the same one that forces you to build your own house, and this one, I would build with unshakable foundations. Even outside Crest Hill, my name kept circulating, not because of publicity, but because in the corporate world, how you handle betrayal, a firing institutional revenge, says far more than any resume ever could. People I'd never met started reaching out. People who said they'd gone through something similar, but never had the courage to fight back. That's when I realized my story wasn't just mine. It could help clear the path for others. Some nights, I'd still get emails from people on the inside, people saying, "Thank you for doing what all of us wanted to do." I never replied, because sometimes silence is the most powerful response. It doesn't try to persuade, it simply affirms. And I had already said everything I needed through my actions. Now it was time to move forward, steady, without bitterness, and with the certainty that the kind of justice we build with patience doesn't need an audience. Today, my office is a room with wide windows facing the Rocky Mountains. I work with 3 monitors, a notepad, and a cup of strong coffee always by my side. The consulting firm I started, Holloway Systems Integrity, began small but grew quickly. I don't advertise. I don't chase contracts, I just do one thing: deliver what I promise, with ethics, with clarity, with structure, and above all, with a purpose that goes far beyond the final invoice. I wake up early, take morning walks with Lorraine. Little by little, we've found our rhythm again. Without tension, without checking the phone like it's a threat. Sundays smell like homemade meals again, and the porch has become a reading spot, something I hadn't done in years. I didn't become a millionaire. I didn't write a book. But I found something that many people chase their whole lives without realizing when it arrives: peace. Every now and then, I get letters from people who followed the case or heard about it from someone else. One of them, a young man working in compliance at a company in Austin, wrote, "Your story helped me realize I don't have to choose between doing the right thing and surviving." I still keep that letter, folded into the last page of an old book on corporate ethics. When the silence of the night feels too loud, I read that line again. And I remember, something good was born from that fall. In the end, it wasn't the layoff that left the biggest mark. It was the way they tried to erase me, as if years of dedication could be wiped away with a single click. But I've learned there's a quiet strength in choosing not to fight back with noise. Real justice moves slowly, with patience, with dignity. And if there's one thing this story taught me, it's that integrity isn't lost, it's proven, even if it takes time, even if no one applauds. If you've stayed with me this far, truly, thank you. Maybe this story touched a place you know too. Maybe a betrayal at work, in your family, or even within yourself. If you feel like it, share your story in the comments. Write about what hurt, what you've overcome, or even what you're still trying to make sense of. Sometimes just putting it into words is the beginning of healing. And you never know who's reading on the other side, needing to hear exactly what you have to say. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told truthfully, with purpose, and without filters, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Around here we talk about falling, but also about rising, about justice, the kind that starts from within.